Okay, we have a very special seminar this afternoon because we have a seminar from our faculty member, Dr. Vasanti Malik. Dr. Malik joined the department only a few years ago, just a bit before the pandemic hit. And so probably many of you really haven't had much interaction with her, and this will be an opportunity for all of us to get a sense of her current research directions. Vasanti, you're there. How be you start sharing your screen? Let me know if you run into any trouble doing that.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Val, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today to share some of my past work that is really informing my current work. Before we get started, I just wanted to share University of Toronto's acknowledgement of traditional land. So we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and then the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, the meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And so, as Val was saying, it's a great pleasure to share some of my work. And so for those of you who don't know my work, my work focuses on the dietary and lifestyle determinants of chronic diseases. And so obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease in children and adults and in populations around the world. More recently, I have an interest in looking at the environmental sustainability of diets. And my work really uses a combination of epidemiological studies, clinical trials, and meta-analysis with the goal of really generating evidence that can drive policy for chronic disease prevention. And this is really important because if we look at global trends, in obesity in recent decades, we can see a steady increase over time. And so what I'm showing you here are trends in obesity prevalence in adults. So obesity prevalence being BMI greater than or equal to 30 in men and women from the in 1980 in blue, in 1980, 2008, and 2016. Men are in shades of blue, women are in shades of red. And we can see across all regions of the world, there's really been an unprecedented rise in the prevalence of obesity in adults. And so we also see similar trends in children. So this slide is showing maps of the world with obesity prevalence defined as having a BMI greater than 2 standard deviations from the median of the WHO growth reference for children who are 5 years of age. And we can see boys are on the top maps, girls are on the bottom panel, and we can see 1980 data on the left and 2016 on the right. And we can see with the deeper shades of red, a rise in obesity in children as well, similar to what we've seen in adults. And this has, this has huge implications on the health and quality of life of children. We know that obesity and metabolic risk factors in childhood contract into adulthood, and obesity is a well-established risk factor for diabetes. And so if we look at global trends of diabetes, we can also see a steady rise across the globe. This is data showing prevalence of diabetes in low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income countries. And we can see across all of these regions, including low income countries and low income regions, there's been a rise in diabetes. And so now if we look at, this is an infographic from the International Diabetes Federation. And so this is showing the number of adults with diabetes worldwide in 2019 and projections for the future. And I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to where the projected increases are really of concern. So really we're looking at lower income and middle income countries where the projected increases are enormous. In Africa, for example, the Middle East and North Africa, and South Asia. And if we look at trends in diabetes in urban India, for example, this is data from Chennai, which is a city in India and in the south. We can see a very rapid rise in diabetes prevalence from about 2% in the 1970s to nearly 20% in 2008. And for comparison, diabetes prevalence in Canada is around 9%. So we can really see in urban India, this is really astonishing. And prevalence has continued to rise since then. And so reasons as to why there's been such a steady, rapid rise in diabetes in India, there are multiple reasons, but one potential reason is the observation that individuals of South Asian ethnicity tend to develop diabetes at a lower BMI compared to other ethnic groups. And so this is a graph, a figure showing an international comparison of the prevalence of obesity in the top panel and diabetes in the bottom panel in different countries. And we can see if we look at India, which is circled there, the prevalence of obesity in India is lowest, but the prevalence of diabetes is the highest. And so in addition to that observation, South Asians have also been shown to develop higher levels of adiposity, including visceral adiposity, for a given BMI level in comparison to Western Europeans. And so some of you might have seen this graphic or this picture or figure before. It's an older one, but I like to show it because it really sort of makes this point very clearly. And so these two individuals have the same BMI, but they have gravely different percent body fat as assessed by DEXA. The individual with a higher body fat being of South Asian origin. And so that's prompted so these observations that South Asians develop diabetes at a lower BMI and a higher proportion of visceral adiposity at a given BMI level compared to Western or European populations prompted the World Health Organization in 2004 to come up with, to establish different cut points for BMI, so lower cut points for BMI for Asian populations. And so, for example, a cut point of BMI for the traditional WHA cut points for overweight are between 25 and less than 30, whereas for the Asian specific cut points, the suggested cut point is between 23 and 27.4. Again, this is based on the observation of Asian populations developing metabolic risk at a lower BMI compared to other populations. And so along these lines, so this was a study here that I'm showing data from, that was a multi-ethnic cohort of almost 60,000 adults in Ontario that were followed for almost 13 years. This is via linkage of administrative data. And what this study looked at, it compared different ethnic groups' risk for diabetes at a given BMI level. And so what this study found was that compared to white adults, those of South Asian, Chinese, and Black ethnicity developed the same proportion of diabetes at a lower BMI. So for South Asians, the equivalent risk that was seen in white adults at a BMI of 30 were observed at a BMI of 24 for South Asians, 25 for Chinese, and 26 for Black. And so my master's student, who's just finished up now, Maria Tinajero, as part of her thesis, she actually conducted a meta-analysis to synthesize this evidence. So she conducted a meta-analysis of studies looking at the association between BMI and diabetes stratified by ethnicity. And so you might have remembered her her presentation from the past year. And so she's in the process of finalizing that meta-analysis, which I think will be a really interesting contribution to this field, because it's still not quite clear what's driving these differences. And I think you know, having this evidence synthesis will help move this literature along. Part of her thesis also addressed whether such differences in cardiometabolic risk are observed in childhood as well. And I think this is a question of great interest. And so she looked at the relationship between ethnicity and cardiometabolic risk in the Target Kids study. And what she found was that, and you might remember some of her findings from her last graduate seminar as well. But what she found was that actually South Asian children did have more adverse cardiometabolic risk factors compared to white ethnicity. And of course, she's in the process of writing this up as well. So we'll be looking out for those publications in their coming up soon. But of course, she did not explore what the determinants of these differences were in the Target Kids cohort. And so that might be sort of the next step in that work. And really understanding these ethnic differences in risk can help with screening practices and really identify those at greatest need for early intervention. And so this is, you know, this is important because if we look at the sort of pipeline of overweight and obesity and diabetes, you know, prevention and early intervention are really key to ensuring population health. We know, as we saw earlier, overweight and obesity are well-established risk factors for diabetes, and diabetes is, of course, an important risk factor for development of heart disease and stroke, kidney disease, as well as blindness, neuropathy. It's one of the leading causes of amputation worldwide. And so, you know, as one can imagine, these conditions have a huge toll on health and quality of life, as well as healthcare expenditures. And this is a big issue in low and middle income countries where we've seen, you know, the burden is shifting, where very high rates of chronic diseases are happening in these parts of the world, alongside undernutrition and infectious disease. So this is a real challenge for these countries who are facing this dual burden. So really highlights the need for prevention. And so now, when it comes to modifiable lifestyle factors, we know that diet is a major player. It's been a major player historically, and this graphic is showing cardiovascular disease burden that's attributable to a number of different modifiable risk factors, and we can see dietary risks as number 2 in 1990 and still is number 2 in 2019, just behind high blood pressure. And of course, we know diet also has an important impact on blood pressure. So really calling attention to diet as a very important modifiable risk factor for the prevention of chronic diseases. And so now among dietary risk factors, sugar sweetened beverages have received a lot of scientific and public interest. And this has been a focus of a lot of my doctoral and postdoctoral work. Sugar sweetened beverages are defined as beverages that contain added caloric sweeteners, such as sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. And just to remind everyone that a 12-ounce can of a typical sugar sweetened beverage contains about 150 calories and about 10 teaspoons or 35 grams of sugar. And so what I'm showing here is that sugar sweetened beverage intake has been increasing across the globe in recent decades. And so this is data from the global dietary database, and it's showing mean intake of sugar sweetened beverages in grams in men in the top panel and women in the bottom panel across 7 major world regions, and we have them sort of defined there on the bottom. And this is in grams, so just to orient everybody, 237 grams is equivalent to 8 fluid ounces. And so we can see Latin America, which is the LAC country, which is defined as LAC, it stands out as having very high intakes of sugar sweetened beverages. But what's really jumps out here is the steady rise across many of these regions. What's not shown in this figure is that sugar sweetened beverage intake in Canada and the US has really been on the decline since the early 2000s. And so, and that's most likely in response to public health efforts calling out or calling for reductions in intake of these beverages, which are the largest contributor to free sugar intake in a diet. And so that nuance is sort of lost in this figure. It's not really coming through in the Western high income country, the HI, which is the countries defined as HIC. And so a lot of studies have looked at the relationship between sugar sweetened beverages and a number of health outcomes. And so since a lot of the data that I'm going to discuss going forward is based on the large cohorts, the large Harvard cohort studies, I just wanted to take a moment. Oh dear, screen has stopped sharing. Oh my, sorry about that. We can get back there. There we go. Oh no, there we go. So I wanted to just take a moment to talk a little bit about the Harvard cohorts. And so these are so 3 large cohorts of health professionals in the United States. So the Nurses Health Study, which includes over 121,000 female registered nurses who are between the ages of 30 to 55 years at baseline in 1976. And these nurses are from across the United States. And in this cohort, data is on health and lifestyle is collected every 2 years via self-report questionnaire, and diet is collected every 4 years via a validated food frequency questionnaire. So similarly, the Nurses Health Study 2 is a similar framework of a cohort of female registered nurses from across the United States. There were 116,000 aged 25 to 42 at baseline. And similarly, data on health and lifestyle are collected every 2 years via questionnaire, and diet every 4 years via a food frequency questionnaire. And then the health professionals follow-up study is a cohort of male health professionals from across the United States, 51,529 who are between the ages of 40 to 75 at baseline in 1986. And similarly, lifestyle and health data is collected every 2 years and diet every 4 years. So these cohorts are large, very well characterized. In addition to these self-reported data, there's also bloods that have been taken and other biofluids as well. There's a very well characterized genetics data and metabolomics, and now microbiome as well. In this cohort, we've looked at a lot of different relationships between sugar sweetened beverages and various health outcomes. And this was a study now published a few years ago, or many years ago now, where we looked at changes in beverage intake and long-term weight gain. And so this was done in the 3 cohorts with 20 or so years of follow-up. But we looked at this relationship in change in beverages in 4-year increments. And so what you're looking at is the weight change associated with 1 serving per day increase in various beverages over 4-year periods. And you can see Nurses Health Study in green, Nurses Health Study 2 in yellow, and the health professionals in orange. And you can see for the 3 cohorts, sugar sweetened beverage intake was positively associated with weight gain, as was fruit juice to a lesser extent, and coffee and plain water intake were inversely associated with weight gain, and none of the other beverages were significantly associated with weight gain. And so just in the pooled estimate where the data from the 3 cohorts were combined, each serving per day of sugar sweetened beverage was associated with just under a pound of weight gain over the 4 years. So about 0.79 pounds in weight gain over a 4-year increment. So we also looked at what happens if you substitute 1 serving of various other beverages, so water, coffee, low-fat milk, tea, or diet drinks, for 1 serving of sugar sweetened beverages or fruit juice. And what we found was that if we did, this is estimated with using cohort data. This is not from a trial. This is using the cohort data to estimate the substitution effect or the substitution association. And so if we would substitute plain water for sugar sweetened beverages, there's about 1 pound less weight gain during each 4-year interval. So really showing strong associations for the association between sugar sweetened beverages and weight gain. And these data were later included in a meta-analysis that we conducted. And this was a meta-analysis that included data or studies from cohort studies in children, cohort studies in adults, randomized controlled trials in adults that were focused on adding sugar sweetened beverages to the diet, and then randomized controlled trials in children that looked at what happens to body weight when sugar sweetened beverages are reduced in the diet and replaced with alternatives, non-caloric beverages. And so what we found was that we found about a 0.05 unit increase in BMI over 1 year in adults. We found associated with a serving per day increase in sugar sweetened beverages. For cohorts that was in children, I'm sorry. For cohort studies in adults, we found about a 0.12 kilogram gain of weight over 1 year per serving per increment of sugar sweetened beverages. And as I'd mentioned, we found that in the trials, adding sugar sweetened beverages to the diet increased body weight in adults. And then for trials in children, reducing sugar sweetened beverages in the diet reduced body weight. And there aren't any trials that I'm aware of in children that have looked at what happens if you add sugar sweetened beverages to the diet. Now, my student, Michelle, my current student, Michelle, right now is working on expanding and updating this meta-analysis. She's also going to be looking at dose response, and she's also looking at juice in relation to weight gain in children and in adults. And she has her seminar coming up in a couple of weeks, and I'm sure she'll be excited to share some of her findings with you. And so consumption of sugar sweetened beverages has also been associated with higher risk of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, with hypertension, cardiovascular disease and mortality, gout, and NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And Michelle, as part of her thesis, she's also going to be looking at the lifetime risk of consuming sugar-sweetened beverages on hypertension using data from the Growing Up Today study. The Growing Up Today study is an interesting study. It's children of the Nurses Health Study 2 cohort. And so this is also a very well characterized cohort where there's data on these individuals from childhood followed right up through, and they're currently in their middle age right now in adulthood. So that'll be a very exciting analysis. And she has some interesting substitution analyses as well that she's going to be looking at. And so these epidemiological studies linking sugar-sweetened beverages to various cardiometabolic outcomes are supported by findings from short-term trials that have helped elucidate some of the biological mechanisms linking sugar-sweetened beverages to adverse health. And I'm not going to go into these in great detail in the interest of time, but I just wanted to put it there because I think it's important when we're looking at observational or epidemiological data that we also look at data from trials of intermediate risk factors to really better understand the associations that we're seeing. And but broadly, sugar-sweetened beverages lead to weight gain through incomplete compensation for calories consumed as liquid sugar, from glycemic effects from the glucose contained in the sugars that are used to sweeten sugar-sweetened beverages, so sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. And these contribute to a sort of a high glycemic load in the diet. And then also from the fructose, metabolic effects of fructose. Fructose is metabolized in the liver, and so sugar-sweetened beverages contain high levels of fructose from the sucrose and high fructose corn syrup that are used to sweeten these beverages. And so collectively, this evidence from the epidemiological studies and trials has had a big impact on informing policies that target sugar-sweetened beverages, such as taxation, labeling, and banning, etc. So here we can really see how epidemiological studies and how our trials come together to inform policy. And so now, switching gears a little bit, another dietary factor that has emerged as an important risk factor for cardiometabolic diseases is red and processed meat. And so here we're looking at data of trends in supply of meat globally and in different parts of the world. And we can see that intake of meat has increased in recent decades, with a particularly rapid rise more recently in middle-income countries such as China and Brazil. So red and processed meat have been associated with a number of health conditions. They've been associated, particularly processed meat, with higher risk of diabetes, coronary heart disease, stroke, and some cancers, as well as mortality. In 2015, the World Cancer Research Fund, WHO, classified red meat as a potential carcinogen and processed meat as a carcinogen. And we know meat processing, such as curing, can lead to formation of certain potentially carcinogenic chemicals, such as N-nitroso compounds and heterocyclic amines. However, there have been inconsistencies in this data, particularly that have surfaced in recent meta-analyses. And I know just after I began my position here at UT in 2019, there was quite a buzz about meta-analyses that were published in Annals of Internal Medicine that we had a fair amount of discussion about. And so some of these inconsistencies regarding the effect of red meat on cardiovascular disease risk are attributable in part to the composition of the comparison diets. And so, when you look at studies where red meat or processed meat are substituted with high quality plant proteins, for example, we can see favorable changes in metabolic risk factors such as lipids, blood lipids, and lipoproteins. However, such benefits are not apparent when red meat or processed meat are replaced with refined carbohydrate, for example. So really the comparison is critical when evaluating the evidence of red meat on cardiovascular risk. And this has also been demonstrated in substitution analyses in cohort studies. And so just for an example, this is a study we published a few years ago that looked at a substitution analysis. This was done in the Harvard cohorts that estimated the risk of diabetes when various foods, including processed meat, potatoes, red meat, were replaced with an equivalent serving per day of nuts and legumes. And we can see so for example, when serving of processed meat was replaced with one serving of nuts and legumes, there was about a 20% lower risk of diabetes. And so again, this is being modeled in cohort data. And so these studies, so findings from this literature, this evidence, is reflected in dietary recommendations from multiple health authorities, including Health Canada, which are now really emphasizing higher intakes of plant-based proteins. This is also consistent with a number of dietary patterns, such as the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, and the portfolio that are, largely plant-based, rich in fruits, vegetables, legumes that have been linked with cardiovascular benefits in trials and in cohort studies. And so this has prompted quite an interest in plant-based diets. So we are seeing many meat alternatives pop up on the market, but there's not a real clear definition on what a plant-based diet is. If you look at this cartoon, extra pickles on your burger doesn't mean you're eating a plant-based diet. So, how do we define this? And so limitations of studies of plant-based diets really highlight this. It's been difficult. These studies have been difficult to translate into recommendations because they tend to focus on binary classifications such as vegetarian or non-vegetarian or vegan versus non-vegan. And this is also difficult to study given the low prevalence of vegetarianism in a lot of populations. And then also in some settings, such as lower income settings, lack of animal products in the diet is actually a marker of poverty. So that's getting at something else. And we also know that not all plant foods are beneficial for health. I just talked about sugar sweetened beverages, for example. Well, that's a plant-based food, but as we've seen, they have been associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And so it's not really feasible from a public health point of view to recommend vegetarianism or veganism. And so a more practical strategy is to consider a graded approach to the diet. So proportion of high quality plant-based foods in the diet versus animal foods, for example. So having a more of a graded approach. And so this is exactly what colleagues at Harvard developed to address this issue. Colleagues at Harvard developed 3 different plant-based indices that utilize this graded approach: a healthy plant-based dietary indice, an unhealthy plant-based dietary indice, and then an overall plant-based diet indice. And so what I'm going to show you here is sort of how this works. And so this is an example of the foods constituting the 18. This is food groups from the Nurses Health Study Food Frequency Questionnaire, and it's so for the overall plant-based dietary index, healthy plant-based foods as well as less healthy plant-based foods. So all of the plant-based foods are positively scored, whereas animal-based foods are reverse scored in the dietary index in the dietary score. And so in contrast, a healthful plant-based, the healthful plant-based diet positively scores healthy plant-based foods, but reverse scores less healthy plant-based foods as well as the animal foods. And then lastly, the unhealthy plant-based dietary index positively scores less healthy plant-based foods, but reverse scores the unhealthy plant-based foods, the healthy plant-based foods and the animal-based foods. And so these dietary indices have been evaluated in relation to a number of health outcomes in the Harvard cohorts, but also in other cohorts as well. And so what I'm showing you here is findings from a study that looked at the relationship between these 3 dietary indices and risk of developing diabetes. And so the healthy plant-based dietary index is shown in blue, the total overall is shown in yellow, and the unhealthy is shown in red. And we can see the overall and healthful are inversely associated with risk of diabetes, while the unhealthy plant-based dietary index is associated with higher risk of diabetes. And of course, when you compare the healthful to the overall plant-based dietary index, we see a stronger inverse association for the healthy plant-based dietary index. And my student, Sarah, was actually, for part of her master's thesis, is synthesizing the evidence of these 3 dietary indices. And so she's working on meta-analyses of these dietary indices in relation to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and weight change. And she's also looking at the nutritional adequacy of different, different eating patterns, such as vegetarian, vegan, and omnivorous, using data from the CCHS, from the Canadian Community Health Survey. And so you'll be seeing those in the pipeline as well. And so recommendations for consuming these healthful plant-based diets are being made for a number of health reasons. We've seen they're linked to health benefits, but also for environmental reasons. So we know food production is one of the largest drivers of environmental degradation. And so this is data now that I'm showing you from the Eat Lancet Commission. So the Eat Lancet Commission was published a couple of years ago that really pulled together the evidence linking animal-based foods to more severe environmental impacts compared to plant-based foods. So what this is showing you is that animal-based foods tend to be more resource intensive than plant-based. And so this is showing the environmental effects per serving of food produced. And we can see the different environmental impacts. So greenhouse gases, land use, energy use, acidification potential, which is a consequence of acids being emitted into the atmosphere, as well as eutrophication potential, which is a pollution of water. And you can see the sort of ruminant meat, pork and chicken, the animal-based products really linked to more intensive environmental impacts compared to the plant-based. And so this is now, there are some important knowledge gaps here, though. First, that our lab group is going to try to address. And so there are many health authorities, including Health Canada, have incorporated environmental sustainability into their dietary guidelines. However, there's not actual hard evidence. For example, there's behind those recommendations, there's no Canadian specific data that says assess the environmental impacts of recommended dietary patterns, or that have jointly considered the healthfulness and environmental impact of individual foods. We know that not all plant foods are beneficial for health, and among plant-based foods, the environmental impacts can vary. So it really is critical to understand the human environmental impact of dietary patterns consisting of different or varying plant-based foods. And so here, what we plan to do is create a database of environmental impacts of foods in the CCHS, so the Canadian Community Health Survey, using databases of life cycle assessment. And so a life cycle assessment is a modeling framework that's used in environmental science that considers aspects of resource use sort of associated with agricultural systems across the food chain. And so this is actually going to be the basis of Sarah's work. She's going to be building on her work on plant-based diets to tackle this. And so this is just a sort of a little bit of schematic about just how we plan to do this. And so we're basically planning to disaggregate foods in the CCHS into their commodity ingredients, and then we're going to match them with environmental impact data from established databases. So the WFLDB and EcoInvent, these are databases of life cycle assessment. And so then we're going to we're going to reconstruct those foods and calculate the total environmental impacts. And we're also going to, in addition to using these databases of life cycle assessment, we're also going to use supply chain estimates. This is called a top-down approach to sort of fill in some data gaps. And then finally, we're going to use these data to assess the environmental impacts of dietary patterns. And so what we're going to do is we're going to estimate weekly consumption of foods in the recommended dietary patterns. We're going to scale them to a 2,000 calorie per day diet so that we're going to be able to compare different dietary patterns with respect to environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, and marine eutrophication. And in addition to that, we're going to create a dietary environmental index which jointly assesses the nutritional quality and environmental impact of individual foods and food groups in the CCHS. So this will be, we hope this will be informative for labeling. And so so stay tuned. There's definitely going to be more to come on this. And so, as we previously discussed, intake of sugar-sweetened beverages is on the rise globally, as is intake of meat, particularly in middle-income countries. And this change is really part of a nutrition transition, which is a process by which sort of traditional diets and lifestyles are replaced by a more sort of westernized lifestyle. So traditional diets that were largely plant-based, consisting of whole grains and fiber, are being replaced with diets that are highly processed, low in fiber, high in refined grains, added sugar, salt, and unhealthy fats, combined with sort of more of a sedentary lifestyle. And of course, as I just mentioned, this type of dietary pattern can have severe environmental impacts. And so the drivers for this transition, urbanization, economic growth, and global free trade, have really caused an unintended consequence of increasing the availability of low-cost foods that are low in nutritional value and high in energy. But I do want to say, of course, urbanization, economic growth have also been very important for many countries in reducing poverty and increasing caloric sufficiency. But one striking feature of the global nutrition transition is an increase in consumption of refined carbohydrate. And so we know that for many countries, the main staple foods in the diet are refined carbohydrates, including rice, corn, and wheat. These three crops provide about 60% of the world's food energy. And so we know from work of David Jenkins and many others that consuming refined grains and processed foods and other rapidly digested carbohydrates result in sort of large and rapid spikes in blood glucose insulin, which over time can lead to insulin resistance and diabetes risk. In contrast, whole grains and other foods such as beans that are rich in fiber are digested more slowly, resulting in sort of gentle rises in blood glucose and insulin. And so this is a meta-analysis that my student Edith is working, has just sort of finalizing now for submission. She was an undergraduate student that started with me through the UROP program. So this is a meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies comparing extreme intakes of white rice as well as brown rice. So white rice is on the left-hand side with many more studies, and brown rice on the right-hand side with fewer studies. In fact, the only studies that were found in this meta-analysis that looked at the relationship between brown rice and risk of diabetes in cohort studies were from the 3 Harvard cohorts. But nonetheless, we still meta-analyzed them. And so if you look at the forest plot for white rice, this is, so comparing the highest category of intake to the lowest, there was a 16% higher risk of diabetes in the random effect model. In contrast, when you look at the meta-analysis of brown rice, there was just about 10% lower risk comparing extreme categories. And I want to, of course, the caveat is those were just sort of studies, 3 studies in the Harvard cohorts. It would be nice if there were more data, cohort data that have looked at brown rice. And I think part of the issue is brown rice intake has historically been quite low in this part of the world. We also conducted, this is now a substitution analysis that we conducted a few years back now in the Harvard cohorts that looked at the association, the relationship with diabetes if you substituted 50 grams per day of brown rice for white rice. And we found about a 16% lower risk based on that substitution estimation. And this work has really been the basis of much of my global work that I hope to get going now that things with the pandemic are starting to wane. And so the Global Nutrition and Epidemiological Transition Initiative, or GNET, is a collaboration between the Harvard School of Public Health and colleagues in a number of countries around the world with the goal of reducing diabetes risk by improving the quality of the diet with a real focus on carbohydrate staples. And so we've done a number of focus groups that have been informative to design trials. And so I know that we're going to run out of time, but I'm almost at the end. So I want to make sure to save room for questions. So just sort of on a real sort of overview. So findings from a number of focus groups. So these focus groups were an important first step before designing trials to really get, to get information from the community about their thoughts about these sorts of potential substitutions. We looked at, these studies were done in China, India, Tanzania, Puerto Rico, Costa Rica, Kuwait, and Nigeria. And across these focus groups, we were really looking at perceptions about replacing refined carb with higher quality carbohydrates. And really, the main barriers to acceptance was a lack of awareness of health benefits, texture, palatability, cost, and scarcity. And of course, suggestions to improve acceptance was a sort of a large-scale promotion of health benefits, subsidies to reduce cost, celebrity endorsement, special recipes, and acceptance by family. And these are just some pictures of the focus groups that were done in some of the countries. And I want to make a point here that this work is collaborative and done with colleagues in these countries. In fact, we worked with a cultural anthropologist in Tanzania who conducted the focus groups, and these were all done in local languages. So we've done stemming from the focus group work, we've done 3 interventions. one in China and two in India, that looked at the impact of replacing white rice with brown rice on metabolic risk factors. And to give you the real sort of, cliff notes, we didn't find any major differences on our primary outcomes of interest. But we did find some interesting subgroup findings. And so the first study in China, this was a 4-month parallel trial. No real between group differences in biomarkers. We did find potential reduction in blood pressure among a group with diabetes, a subgroup of participants who had diabetes. We did a short glucose monitoring, continuous glucose monitoring study in India that compared a short crossover that compared diets consisting of white rice, and brown rice with legumes. And we did find a benefit of brown rice and brown rice legume diets over white rice. But again, this was a very short 5-day crossover study of continuous glucose monitoring. But that was an important study because it sort of helped us design the future trial, which we focused on replacing white rice with brown rice, as opposed to brown rice with legumes, because we didn't see a difference between brown rice and brown rice legume diets in this short continuous glucose monitoring study. So in the full trial, which was a 3-month crossover trial, we did not find significant between group differences on our primary outcomes, but we did see signals for improvements in glycemic control and some lipids, comparing brown rice to white rice among those who had a BMI greater than equal to 25. And so, so just where that work is now, I have some ongoing studies. I won't go into them in great detail. Maybe, hopefully I can do another seminar at another time where I focus on some of the global work. But I just did want to mention that we have a really neat collaborative study in Puerto Rico that's adapted the Mediterranean diet to a Puerto Rico-centric diet that's looking on biomarkers. A really very cool study in Nepal, which is a work site study in 2 work sites, one at a hospital and one at a wire factory, where we're looking again at sort of changes to the diet on metabolic risk factors in these 2 settings. And then in India, we're just now finishing up a work site intervention, which was a translation of the diabetes prevention program. And then we're also starting a new initiative through a global nutrition hub, which is a collaboration with myself and colleagues in Scotland, which is another work site intervention in the 4 sort of areas of India: north, south, east, and west. And we're also going to be looking at environmental impacts as outcomes in addition to biomarkers there. And so just to sort of end, as I mentioned, the overall goal of my work is to really create evidence that can inform policies and dietary recommendations for prevention of chronic diseases, and more recently to promote environmental sustainability. And of course, given the scope and complexity of chronic diseases, policy strategies across multiple levels are needed. And I just sort of highlighted schools here because I do have a couple students starting in with me in January as part of the Lawson Centre of the Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds work. We're going to be looking at perceptions about school meals using qualitative studies. And schools represent an important opportunity to improve food security as well as diet quality. And so to summarize, we've seen this global increase in diabetes and obesity across the globe. We know that dietary risks are an important contributor to the global burden of disease, particularly with respect to processed meats, red meats, sugar sweetened beverages, higher intakes of refined grains. And of course, improving the quality of the diet is one potential strategy to prevent chronic diseases and improve environmental quality or environmental sustainability. And we need policy strategies across all levels to achieve this. And with that, I I thank you, and I just wanted to acknowledge my lab group, collaborators, and funding.